Before we begin, this episode is not scripture, it's not a sermon, and it's definitely not the kind of Sunday school lesson that ends with a neat little bow. What you're about to hear, it's a story that wasn't meant to be remembered. Not because it wasn't important, but because it's unsettling. Because it cracks the myth wide open. We're not here to fight theology. We're not here to mock belief. We're here to tug at the forgotten threads that history left dangling and follow them into the dark. What if the garden wasn't the beginning? What if it was a perimeter, a test site, a container? And what if someone was already outside the gates? Let's pick up where we left off. Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, has just murdered his brother. God banishes him, placing a strange and merciful mark upon him, and Cain walks east of Eden. And then something strange happens. And Cain knew his wife, and he built a city. His wife? A city? Where did she come from? Who was he building for? This is the moment the story glitches. Because if Adam and Eve were the first humans, and Cain and Abel were their only sons, then who exactly was Cain afraid of when he cried, "Whoever finds me will kill me"? Who was already out there? Maybe Eden was never empty, but maybe the outside never was either. What if the garden wasn't the first spark of life, but the first controlled environment? And what if Adam and Eve weren't humanity's prototypes, but a subset of something older? What if the real story didn't begin with their creation, but with their separation from whatever was already living, thriving, evolving on the other side of the gate? Somewhere between myth and memory, there are stories of ancient ones who lived before the garden, of bloodlines that didn't begin with dust, but with stars, oceans, and fire. We were taught not to ask about them, but here we are. What if Cain's exile wasn't punishment? What if it was contact, a merging, a crossing of streams? Because the moment he left Eden, something new began, and maybe it wasn't just his story, maybe it was theirs. Genesis chapter 4, verse 16. So Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The land of Nod. We don't know where it is. We don't know who named it. We don't even know if it ever existed on a real map. But it's there, carved in scripture like a whisper no one followed. Cain steps out of divine presence and walks into something else. A land already called something. A direction already marked. East of Eden. Not north, not south, not some vague nowhere. East. As if someone had already charted it. As if something, someone, was already there. This is the first time in the Bible that humanity walks into a world that isn't described as freshly made. There is no, "and God said." No, "it was good." Just, he went. And suddenly we are no longer in creation. We are in consequence. We are in Nod. In Hebrew, Nod means wandering. It is the land of exile, a place of movement without home, of names without roots, of survival without story. Or so we're told. But what if that is not what Nod was at all? What if wandering wasn't punishment, but discovery? What if Nod was the place where the veil thinned, where exiles meet echoes, and the past met the forgotten? Cain walked east, and east, in nearly every sacred system, is not just a direction. It is a beginning, the place where the sun returns, where light breaks the veil, where resurrection begins. So maybe Cain wasn't cursed. Maybe he was the first to wake up. Because if we allow ourselves to leave Eden, really leave it, and walk into Nod, we begin to sense that there were others. Not angels, not demons, but people. People who had always been there, living, building, watching, maybe not in the image of God, or maybe in the image of a God we were never introduced to. Maybe they were wild, free, strange. Maybe they were part human. Maybe they weren't. But Cain found them, or they found him, because somehow, in that wild place called Nod, he takes a wife. He starts a lineage. He builds a city. A man with a broken past, a cursed mark and no family, builds something that only makes sense if people were already there. He names it Enoch, after his son. Not a shack, not a tent, a city. What kind of city rises from a single man? What kind of knowledge would he need to build it? And where did it come from? This is where the story starts to bleed, where Eden's neat lines begin to blur. Because Cain didn't wander into nothing. He wandered into memory, into myth, into the cracks between what we were told and what was always there. Maybe Nod wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was an invitation. Because when Cain crossed east, the story of Eden ended, and the story of everything else began. Cain walked east, built a city, took a wife, and just like that, the myth of singular creation crumbles. Because in order for Cain to find people, people must have already been there. And the Bible doesn't explain them. No names, no origin, no account of their beginning. Just an open question. Who were they? Some say they were Adam and Eve's unmentioned children, that the couple had dozens of sons and daughters over the centuries, that Cain married a sister, that incest was the original necessity, not a taboo, but a requirement. And maybe that's part of the truth. But let's ask the forbidden version of the question. What if Cain didn't find a sister? What if he found a stranger? What if others had already evolved? What if humanity or something close to it already existed beyond Eden's walls? What if the garden wasn't the first human habitat, but the first controlled one? A divine greenhouse, a prototype, and outside it were the wild ones. This isn't a new idea. Ancient Sumerians spoke of Adamu, a clay-formed man created by gods to tend their land. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Enkidu, a wild man from the forest, unshaped by civilization until he's tamed by a woman and brought into society. Even the Greeks had stories of early humans, the Golden Age people, who lived freely before gods meddled. There's always a story of something older, something before the garden, before the fall, before divine control. So what if Cain's exile wasn't a descent into wilderness, but a reunion with something older than Genesis? Imagine it. A man marked by God, carrying divine wrath, or divine protection, depending how you read it, wandering into the wild and finding people who had never known Eden, who had never walked with God in the cool of the day, who had never been told not to eat the fruit, who had never fallen because they were never bound. People who lived without shame, without exile, without commandments. Can you imagine what that meeting looked like? I would love to be a fly and just, travel back in time and be a fly. Or just be me, actually, traveling back in time and going to watch that interaction. I mean, I know we are talking theoretically, right? So if this happened, it would have been so cool, right? I think so. Maybe they feared him, or maybe they recognized him. Maybe they touched the mark on his brow and whispered, "You're one of them, aren't you?" Or maybe, just maybe, they saw in him the beginning of the end. The Bible doesn't give them names, but other stories do. Stories whispered in ancient tongues, in tablets and scrolls we weren't meant to read. Stories of the first daughters of earth, of unions between divine and human, of watchers who fell from heaven and those who were waiting for them. Cain's wife may have been one of them, a daughter of dust, or fire, or both. Because once Cain joined with the others, the line of Adam was no longer pure, if it ever was. The bloodline had crossed, and so had the story. From now on, there are two lineages running side by side, one from Eden and one from before. Let's stay with them for a moment, the ones Cain found outside the garden. We don't know their names, we don't know their gods, but something about them endured, because when Cain joined with them, something changed. Suddenly we begin to see tools, music, metals, cities. A new kind of human story emerges, not one of innocence and obedience, but of craft, creation, and consequence. The children of Cain are not farmers. They don't walk with God. They don't till Eden soil. They are builders, makers, moulders of sound and substance. His son Enoch, not to be confused with the later righteous one, by the way, is the first to have a city named after him. His descendants, they give us Jubal, the father of all who play the harp and flute. Jabal, the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. From the line of exile comes civilization. But where did this knowledge come from? Metallurgy doesn't appear out of nowhere. Stringed instruments aren't born from sticks and instinct. Architecture, herding, craftsmanship, these are learned, taught. So the question burns brighter now. Who were the others, and what did they know? The Book of Enoch tells us that the Watchers, divine beings, came down and taught forbidden knowledge to humanity. The Sumerians speak of gods bestowing the meh, sacred knowledge, to chosen kings and priestesses. Prometheus gave fire to man and was punished for it. Inanna descended into the underworld and returned with power. In every ancient system, knowledge is a gift or a theft. Rarely it is accidental. So maybe the ones outside Eden weren't just people. Maybe they were preservers, guardians of memory, echoes of a civilization long past, or parallel. Maybe Cain didn't start civilization. Maybe he inherited it, merged into it. Because tools leave marks, metal sings its own memory, music travels farther than blood, and the line of Cain left echoes, even if they were later demonized, erased, flooded. They were here, and they knew something. Not all knowledge begins in light. Sometimes it begins in exile. Cain's story doesn't end with exile. It begins there. Because from the moment he steps into Nod and joins with the others, his descendants begin to shape the world in ways Eden never did. Not with obedience, not with altars, but with invention. Enoch, builder of cities. Jabal, ancestor of tents, livestock, and nomadic life. Jubal, father of music, the harp, the flute. Tubal-Cain, smith and metallurgist, shaper of bronze and iron. This wasn't just a family tree. This is the origin of technology, of sound, of shelter, of structure. These are not priest kings or prophets. They are makers. Cain may have spilled blood, but his children spilled songs. They forged tools. They birthed cities. They stitched memory into metal and melody. The line of exile became the line of creation. And yet, they were never celebrated. In the Bible, their names are almost throwaway mentions, side notes, no moral attached, just a list as if the text wants to forget them as quickly as it remembers them. Why? Why would the founders of culture be so casually listed? Unless they were a threat. Because the ones who invent new ways of living, new tools, new sounds, new freedoms, are always dangerous to systems built on obedience. They are wild cards. They're not waiting for divine instruction. They're not afraid of exile. They're busy building, and that is revolutionary. In Sumerian myth, the goddess Ninhursag helps form the first humans to do the god's labor. But it's the craftsmen, the scribes, the metal workers who rise as powerful figures. In Egypt, the god Ptah speaks the world into being through thought and craft. In Greek lore, Hephaestus, or Hephaestus, as you say it, the lame god of fire and forge, is cast out of Olympus but creates wonders from exile. In every tradition, the smith, the builder, the song weaver holds sacred power. So why is Cain's lineage treated as a footnote? Maybe because their knowledge didn't come from the approved source. They weren't taught by God in the garden. They weren't handed commandments on a mountain. They learned by doing, by fusing, by listening to stone and spark and sound. That kind of learning, experiential, embodied, inherited from the others, was a threat to the priesthood, to the script, to the story of holy hierarchy. The makers were inconvenient, brilliant, unorthodox, and powerful, and so slowly they were erased. But culture remembers what scripture forgets. Every hammer that rings on metal, every string that hums with song, every shelter raised by human hands, carries a trace of them. The exiled makers, the builders from the bloodline no one wanted, but everyone needed. The last name in Cain's line before the flood is Tubal-Cain, and if you blink, you'll miss him. Genesis chapter 4, verse 22. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. That's it. One line, a single sentence. But behind that sentence is fire, is legacy, is forbidden knowledge. Tubal-Cain is the first metal worker in the Bible, the father of smelting, of weapons, of industry. Bronze and iron, the tools of survival and the tools of war. And in ancient cultures, those who could manipulate metal were closer to the gods than to men. Because metal is not just found, it is transformed. Ore must be dug, crushed, purified in fire, shaped by hand, hammered with vision. This isn't farming. This is alchemy. In many traditions, the smith is a sacred figure, keeper of secrets, transformer of worlds. The Celts revered the blacksmith as a magician. The Greeks feared and honored Hephaestus, lame in form but powerful in craft. And in Jewish mysticism, Tubal-Cain became something more, a symbol of rebellion, of sacred fire, of the spark that refuses to die. Some legends say Tubal-Cain was taught by fallen angels, that his knowledge came not from God, but from watchers who descended from heaven with forbidden teachings. In the book of Enoch, one of the watchers, Azazel, teaches men to work with metal, to craft swords, knives, breastplates, mirrors. And to women, he teaches enchantments and beautification, knowledge, beauty, power, the very things later labeled sinful. So who was Tubal-Cain? A student of angels? A rebel of the forge? A survivor of memory? In Freemasonry, his name lives on, used in ritual, whispered in initiations, seen as a guardian of ancient craft and transformation. Some say his name is a cipher, and that Tubal links to TBL, meaning world or abundance, and Cain, of course, to the first blood. Together he is the abundance of exile, the weapon of memory, the fire no flood can drown. When the line of Cain ends, Tubal-Cain is the last light in the forge, the last echo of makers before the flood comes to wash it all away. But fire once given never truly dies. It waits. It smoulders. It passes hand to hand in the quiet until someone remembers. After the dust of exile settles, after Cain has wandered east, taken a wife, built a city, and birthed a legacy of makers, the Bible resets. Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me for another child in place of Abel, because Cain killed him. And just like that, a new line is born. The pure line, the favored one, the one Scripture wants us to follow. Seth becomes the new beginning, the chosen replacement, the one whose descendants will eventually lead to Noah, and later to Abraham, to David, to Jesus, the bloodline of prophecy, the clean, moral, righteous thread. Or so we're told. But let's look closer. Seth is not Adam's firstborn. He's not even the second. He's the third son, born after death and exile, born into a world already fractured, and yet he's treated like the true heir. Why? Because he wasn't Cain? Because he didn't kill? Or because he never left? Cain left the presence of God. Seth never had to. Cain built. Seth inherited. Cain's children shaped culture. Seth's preserved ritual. One was wild, the other obedient. One was dangerous, the other safe. And that's what purity often means, isn't it? Not truth, not wisdom, but compliance. But blood doesn't forget, and the ground remembers every footprint. So when Seth's line is lifted high, declared sacred, holy, set apart, we should ask, set apart from what? From sin or from story? In almost every myth, there are two lines. One that burns with chaos and invention, one that walks the straight path. Cain and Seth, Prometheus and Epimetheus, Enkidu and Gilgamesh, the wild and the wise. One breaks the world open, the other holds the rules together. But without the wild one, there are no tools, no songs, no cities. Without the obedient one, there is no continuity, no covenant, no record. They are the opposite limbs of the same origin myth, and both carry the truth. So before we follow Seth's clean line, before we praise the purity of his descendants, we might ask, did the divine truly choose his line? Or did history? Or did the ones who wrote it? Because sometimes the righteous path is just the one that survived the edit. Seth's line begins quietly. No cities, no fires, no flutes. Just a child named Enosh. And it is with Enosh, Seth's grandson, that something shifts. Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. It's a short verse, but it changes everything. Because up until now, no one has. Not Adam, not Eve, not Cain, not even Seth himself. But now, with Enosh, there is a name. But which name? In Hebrew, the phrase is, then it was begun to call upon the name of Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, Yod, He, Vav, He, the unspoken name, the breath between syllables, the mystery that Judaism later refused to pronounce. Sorry, there was a wasp right in front of me. This is the first time Yahweh is invoked in the biblical timeline. but it's not clear who started it, or why. Some scholars say this verse means true worship began. Others argue the opposite, that this was the first corruption, that the calling wasn't prayer, but invocation, a reaching into the divine, a pulling down of power. In other words, the beginning of ritual, of magic, of hierarchy, of separating sacred names from ordinary breath. In most ancient cultures, knowing the true name of a god meant holding power over it. To call a name was to summon, to whisper it was to bind it. So what if Enosh's line didn't just invent religion, but invented control? In Egypt, names held Ka, spiritual force. To erase a name from the record was to curse a soul to oblivion. In Mesopotamia, names of gods were engraved into tablets and hidden. Only initiates could speak them. In Jewish mysticism, the Shem HaMephrosa, the Shem HaMephrash, the explicit name of God, was believed to hold creative or destructive power. So when the line of Seth begins calling on the name, they're not just worshipping. They're naming, framing, invoking. And from here the line of Seth begins to grow. Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, names stacked like bricks, each carrying a whisper of legacy. They are the keepers of the line, the watchers of the sacred. But just as this line reaches towards righteousness, something begins to stir on the edges, something that doesn't belong to earth, and isn't quite from heaven. Because just as Seth's line begins calling on the divine starts to descend. As Seth's lineage grows, so does the silence between verses. Adam dies, generations pass, the earth fills with names like Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel. Then comes Jared, and something changes. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. This is a quote from Genesis chapter 5, verse 18. But that's not all. Jared's name in Hebrew, Yared, comes from the verb yarad. It means to descend. To descend. Not rise, not stand, not return, but fall. And many ancient texts, especially the book of Enoch, tell us that in the days of Jared, the watchers came down. Divine beings, boundless power, forbidden hunger. They crossed the threshold between heaven and earth. We won't follow them just yet. Not here, because once they fall, everything changes. But even without them, you can feel the air shifting. The names get longer, the lifespans stretched into myth. Methuselah lives 969 years. Good Lord. Can you imagine if you could live to nearly 1,000 years old? Like, what would you do with that entire time? What would you be doing with your life? Honestly, come and answer me. What would you think? Could you endure it? Like just going on for nearly 1,000 years? Living life? I don't know. That seems like a long, long time. Anyways, Lamech gives birth to prophecy. And Enoch walks with God and vanishes. This isn't history. This is myth breeding through lineage. And all the while, something is building. We are walking in the days of descent, the quiet before the storm, the golden age before the flood, the generations where time stretched thin, and the veil between realms began to tear. And just before that tear rips open, we see two names, standing like altars on opposite ends of the same bloodline. Enoch, seventh from Adam in the line of Seth. Lamech, seventh from Adam in the line of Cain. Both seventh, both transitional, both tied to prophecy, fear, mystery. One walks with God, the other fathers to Cain. It's as if the cosmos is mirroring itself. Two sevens, two branches, two truths. One will be taken, one will be drowned. And in the space between those two lines, the heavens begin to stir. Let's return to where we began. Eden, a garden, a beginning, a boundary. We were told it was the origin of humanity, the divine prototype, the moment breath met dust. But now, we followed the line out. We've walked east with Cain, we've watched cities rise, we've heard music and metal echo through time. We've traced the pure line of Seth and felt the tremble in the days of Jared. And still the question lingers. Who were the others? We don't know their names, we don't know their gods, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In the wives taken without origin, in the knowledge passed without instruction, in the crafts, the cities, the mysteries that came too soon for a world of only one family. Maybe they were wild tribes. Maybe they were ancient kin. Maybe they were the remnants of a parallel creation, a forgotten attempt, a first draft. Or maybe they weren't like us at all. Maybe they were watchers, wanderers, descendants of stars, of something older than memory. Maybe the others are the reason the flood had to come. Because something was spreading. Two bloodlines, two stories. Cain's, cursed but creative. Seth's, pure but silent. And in between them, something ancient moved. Something we weren't meant to remember. Because the garden may have been sealed, and Eden may have been forgotten, but the world outside it was never empty. It was waiting, it was watching, and it was never erased, only rewritten. If this stirs something in you, if you're piecing these threads together with me, come and find me on TikTok at wildlywoven279. Let's keep this podcast evolving, and let's make sure the conversation doesn't end. Next time, we follow the descent, when heaven broke its own rules and the watchers touched earth. See you next time. Bye!